I hate being the bearer of this news, but here we go. I'll begin with a quote from February. Here it is. I feel like we are in a stronger position now. Netease has clearly been evaluating their portfolio. They decided our game is the one they want to focus on. So those words were said by Greg Street. He's a marine biologist turned Age of Empires developer turned World of Warcraft developer turned Riot MMO lead, who then, with the backing of Netease, went and made a new studio, one that would be making an MMO. And in that post, he was responding to fears about his new studio, Fantastic Pixel Castle. Fears that they would lose funding for their upcoming MMO, which is called Ghost. Now, at the time, we talked about it on this channel because we saw Netease pulling out of many other companies and essentially rug pulling loads of studios that they made real financial commitments to. And now, fast forward to 9th of October 2025, Netease is no longer funding the project. Remember, Greg Street literally said, they decided our game is one they want to focus on, and now it's very obviously, well, not the case. And so this is another studio formed by veteran talent, another promise of support from a major industry player, and now another company put at risk, all because of the changing whims of the C-suite. So you understand what's going on. Greg Street was the lead systems designer at Blizzard for WoW. He stayed there until 2013, and audiences loved him, sometimes hated him, but for the same reason, because he actually engaged with the community on feedback. Very active developer. But then Riot asked him to lead their MMO. He spent years working in that MMO and, well, it's quite obviously at this stage, no MMO. I wonder how many times that thing's been reset. Of course, in 2023, he left Riot and he revealed Fantastic Pixel Castle. This would be a first-party Netease studio, and they would build a new AAA fantasy MMO called Ghost. The plan was actually smart. It was to take advantage of the talent of Greg Street and his collaborators to basically assemble a crack squad of hand-picked devs, but then to do something smart, and that is to be as efficient as is possible. The reasons why are quite obvious. MMOs can get extremely expensive. They can go wrong. So the promise here was very simple. A small team working remotely that, when they needed scale, would take advantage of outsourcing. And for the first few years, things actually looked good. There were transparent communications that kept people engaged. Milestone prototypes were shown off publicly. They were designing and producing zones. Those would get revealed. Player feedback was shaping the development. And actually, over the last few months, things really got faster. Classes started being showcased. There were streamer-backed marketing tests, and all of that seemed to be a show of strength. Right after Greg Street said, "We're the game they chose." Obviously now, that looks a little bit different. And now for the bad news. So here's the opening to Greg Street's October post. Fantastic Pixel Castle's time as a first-party studio within Netease Games is coming to an end. He goes on in the letter to thank his team and the fans, but he painted a dire picture. Netease had been helping the team find a new publisher, but they just had not had any luck. And without new funding soon, well, the studio and the project would be shuttered. But here's the worst thing. We knew this would be coming. We actually did. Bloomberg reported in August that Fantastic Pixel Castle were facing difficulties. Netease had reviewed the studio's financing, and it turns out the $100 million total budget they had planned was one that they could no longer support. Now, Street makes something very clear in this. It's that he's willing to compromise if it means he can save the studio. And the team has clearly been working on an exit strategy here. He claimed that there's a Helldivers or Elden Ring Night Rain version of the game, a different take in the game that would need half the budget and is already half completed, or even that Fantastic Pixel Castle themselves could be slotted into an existing studio, that they could work on any project as a development team. One of the things he wants to do is save his squad. Both of these were presumably offered to Netease. Obviously, neither were accepted. So here we are. 2 years after being founded to deliver an MMO, Fantastic Pixel Castle had the rug pulled out, and they are far from the first. Obviously, they couldn't deliver a project that massive in a 2-year time frame. Now they will not get the chance, at least under Netease. And if that sounds familiar, you would be right, because Netease have pulled this exact same trick many times over the last few years. Netease's treatment of developers hasn't exactly been great. It's been one of the defining stories of the last few years. So they spent 2020 onwards offering funding and studio leadership positions to veteran developers. This basically meant BioWare, 343 Industries. God, I think a lot of people want to escape the hell of whatever 343's been. Also Capcom and many other studios. And the pitch was simple: get free from the constraints of IP, escape stagnant corporate leadership, make the games that they wanted to make. And then Netease started closing these studios before they had a chance to release anything. This, to be clear, is not a case of, oh, this studio's really, really late, where's the game? No. As an example, Worlds Untold operated for a year, Jar of Sparks got 2 years, Ocus Studios released Visions of Mana, and Netease then fired all of the staff during its release week. What's all this stuff about? Well, it's quite simple. It's about return on investment. Analyst Daniel Ahmad pointed something out here, that this is part of a wider trend that Chinese game publishers like Netease invested heavily overseas, and they haven't exactly generated significant returns from that. Or maybe that they regret some of the bets that were placed during the boom times. Of course, a boom time that many of us have criticized on the internet. The expectation was perhaps that these studios would have something ready to ship, or at least they would show market potential. Of course, expecting that for a MMO within 2 years is absolutely insane. Now, you could read Fantastic Pixel Castle's moves as trying to prove potential here. Just look at what they've been doing, showcasing classes, doing creator marketing. Quite clearly a chance to show Netease there was value, that there was engagement, but also clearly it didn't work. But there is a specific Netease aspect to this story. You see, Netease has always denied one thing, that thing being that their actions are linked to a systemic withdrawal from non-Chinese first-party studios. And a lot of this comes to, well, a fun guy. Because sources told GamesBeat something a little bit different to what the Netease line was. And that is that the company's CEO and founder has basically lost faith in a plan to increase Netease's investment outside of China. And this led to something big. So here's the deal. Simon Zhu, he was the president of Global Investments and Partnership, and he stepped down in April. He is pivotal to this. One of GamesBeat's sources said, quote, everything that Netease's Zhu touched were now going to be unwound. All investments, all holdings. And now that Fantastic Pixel Castle's funding has been pulled, it really does seem that the quoted word everything is accurate. The last time we covered this, we framed it around a bunch of single-player studios, like ex-BioWare staff, and, well, we thought there was a reason why they were especially at risk, because they didn't fit Netease's interests. All those games that we mentioned, the ones cancelled over the last few years, they were pretty much all single-player narrative games. Things never able to generate Marvel Rivals money. Just consider the math. 2 years of development funded, maybe 2 to 3 to 4 more to finish a big MMO. And also, American wages compared to Chinese wages. And then think about the potential returns. A single-player game from a new team? Compared to Netease's financial bread and butter, just makes absolutely no sense. So in a way you could see the logic. Kill all those single-player RPGs, invest in more multiplayer stuff, like Marvel Rivals, or maybe an MMO called Ghost. But as time went on, the picture changed. August saw the closure of T-0 Entertainment. Netease walked away from funding their game. Their game was a third-person multiplayer action game about taking on kaiju. Netease's North American head of publishing called it, quote, great market fit. But obviously that's not the complete quote, is it? Because he also said that they were sorry that they couldn't, and this is the quote, get you there in the time needed to. And this is why Greg Street said something back in February, that the Ghost was the one they wanted to focus on. It turns out that he should have used a different word, that word being scrutinize. That's perhaps why he had survived all the cuts thus far. But after scrutinization, Netease were not happy. Maybe they weren't willing to wait until a full game would come out. Now, for the rest of their portfolio, things are up in the air, and I've got to say there's some projects that I know a lot of you do care about. As an example, Anchor Point and Rebel Wolves. Rebel Wolves, you may know more, they're some of the ex-CD Projekt Red people. Well, back in February, they said they were safe. It was about whenever Fantastic Pixel Castle said they were safe. Now, I think they're probably safe. In the case of Rebel Wolves, their founders do own the majority of the company, and they've got a separate publisher. That's brilliant. So, It's a bit of a minority investment from Netease's perspective and doesn't confer as much risk. But even for them, if they've perhaps banked in future funding, then that could go wrong. As for the other studio, Anchor Point, it was founded in 2023 by Netease across 3 global locations. So to be real, it does seem like they're also on the clock. You may be wondering what happens next then, because companies like Grasshopper Manufacture or, of course, Quantic Dream you'll certainly know, David Cage, funny fella, lots of stories. Well, they were purchased outright by Netease. Are they also on the clock, to get that revenue in? In theory, Netease could sell those companies on, or even back to their original owners. But here's the question. It's 2025. Who would even buy them? Back to the focus of the video though, Fantastic Pixel Castle. They could in theory find new funding. It is not an impossible thing. But here's what Greg Street himself said, quote, "In the current market environment, very few deals are getting made for any game, let alone something on the scale of an MMORPG. Yeah, so that boom that Netease invested in, it was a bit of a splurge built on hype." The factoid I always wheel out for this one is that World of Warcraft Shadowlands, widely regarded to be one of the largest misfires in that whole game's history, was also the fastest selling PC game of all time, because there was a big lockdown and that was an MMO that was being sold. A lot of things got very funky in those days. Just take a look at the stock graph for Zoom or Peloton. It all got silly. So for a lot of these companies, like Netease, they invested hundreds of millions of dollars overseas, trying to take advantage of what appeared to be a massive rise in gaming. But the reality is, well, that's a lot of money, and gaming did not keep on rising in the way that they perhaps expected. And now we're left in a dire position where all these developers were led by seasoned staff who left their jobs to take a chance, and they did so on a promise. The promise that their backers would support them. That it may work, or it may not work, because that's the gamble of game development. Maybe the game comes out good, maybe it doesn't. But they get a proper shot at it, and hey, they were vets. They'd already made a lot of mistakes in the past, so, wouldn't make them again in the future. And the sad thing is, the chance they were promised is one that has now been taken away before it seems they've actually got to take the chance. Before the consumer market has been able to judge the quality of their output. Why? Well, because at the highest level of a C-suite, one man, William Ding, changed his mind. And now hundreds of developers will find themselves trying to, find work. Somewhere, wherever it may be. And it really is quite rough for us. Because you see, in an ideal world, people, they put in 10, 15, 20 years. And then maybe they go start their own company. And they do so with backing. And that is how, as time goes on and sort of generations of people move through the industry, we get the creation of new companies, new ideas, the sort of thing that you can't really do as an indie game because it is actually quite expensive and you need real serious investment. It seems that there was a wave of that investment, one that has just across the board been quite rug pulled. And that has led to the sorts of people who would be founding the next generation of studios to be a little bit back at square one. And I think for those of us who are in the consumer side of this market, that's really goddamn bad. Because there's a lot of really goddamn cool new games we're probably not going to get. I certainly know what people mean when they say that it's as if you've got the indie scene and then you've got the real big budget, your EAs and stuff, but just in between, this is kind of dying out. Pretty rough. But if you love death, destruction, doom, failed promises, and all of that, I think you should watch this video next. It's actually great. It's about Battlefield, and I love the Battlefield's doing well. But the story of how we got here is more interesting than I think you know. You may not know that, actually, to make Battlefield 6, a studio got killed. And we even know why the campaign is whatever the hell it actually is. I've played it. It's pretty weird, but after you watch this video, you'll certainly understand a lot more.